Hi dear researchers, how are you today? I hope you're ready for another class. In this opportunity, we're going to learn about data collection techniques and instruments. Data collection techniques. The data collection techniques allow us to systematically collect information about our objects of study, which can be people, objects, or phenomena in general, and about the settings in which they occur. Let's see the first technique. This is the observation. Observation is a technique that involves systematically selecting, watching, and recording behavior and characteristics of living beings, objects, or phenomena. It can be undertaken in different ways. For example, participant observation. The observer takes part in the situation he or she observes. That is why it is called participant. For example, a doctor hospitalized with a broken hip who now observes hospital procedures from within. When doing participant observation, the doctor, for example, can have the opportunity to observe things that he couldn't be able to observe as a doctor. So he pretends that he's a patient hospitalized. Non-participant observation. This type of observation is mainly conducted in quantitative studies. The previous one is mainly done in qualitative studies. In non-participant observation, the observer watches the situation openly or concealed, but does not participate. In other words, the researcher is detached from the target population. Observation can also be made on objects. For example, the presence or absence of a language laboratory and its state of cleanliness may be observed. Here, the observation would be the major research technique, because what is important for the researcher is to observe the condition, especially of an object, in this case the laboratory, a language laboratory. That is the technique, but the tool is the observation guide, the one that the researcher will create to have at hand in order to collect the data. Another technique is the interview. An interview is a data collection technique that involves oral questioning of respondents, either individually or as a group. Answers to the questions posed during an interview can be recorded by writing them down either during the interview itself or immediately after the interview, or by recording the responses, or by a combination of both. In other words, the researcher can write down the answers and also record them at the same time. The tool to be used in this technique is the interview guide, the one that the researcher prepares with questions. Administering questionnaires or survey. The questionnaire is a data collection technique in which written questions are presented to be answered by the respondents in the written form, only in the written form. And this is the tool or the technique mainly used in quantitative studies. And the tool to be used is called written questionnaire or questionnaires. There are structured questionnaires as well as unstructured questionnaires. The structured questionnaires are the ones mainly used in quantitative studies. because they already contained everything to be used during the data collection process. There may also be unstructured questionnaires, which can be structured or can be added questions at the moment of the data collection, but this is done in qualitative studies. The structured questionnaires include questions that can be pre-categorized. In other words, the possible responses are provided for the respondent to choose from. These type of questionnaires are an example of quantitative research techniques. The answers to questions can be counted and expressed numerically at the moment of organizing the data to be analyzed. Questionnaires for qualitative studies. Let's see a little bit about this. The questions are post-categorized. In other words, they are open questions, mainly, right? In qualitative studies. The respondents aren't given any choice to choose from. They are free to answer with as much information as they wish. Interviewing and administering questionnaires are probably the most commonly used research techniques. Therefore, designing good questioning tools forms an important and time-consuming phase in the development of most research proposals. It means that you're not going to prepare a list of questions and that's it. You have to make sure that the questionnaire is so well structured that you don't have any problem at the moment of data collection. Types of questions used in interviews. Now let's talk a little bit about interviews. Depending on how questions are asked and recorded, we can distinguish two major possibilities. Open-ended questions, which allowed for completely open as well as partially categorized answers, and closed questions. Let's talk about open-ended questions. Completely open-ended questions permit free responses, which should be recorded in the respondent's own words. Such questions are useful for obtaining in-depth information on facts with which the researcher is not very familiar with. Opinions, attitudes, and suggestions of informants or sensitive issues are asked in completely open-ended questions, but these are mainly used in interview guides, which are used in qualitative studies. Don't forget that. For example, we can ask, what is your opinion on the services provided in? And then you ask the respondent to explain why. Another question that can be asked is, what do you think are the reasons some adolescents in this area start smoking? What would you do if you noticed that your daughter, schoolgirl, had a relationship? The answers to these questions are written down when they are transcribed as closely as possible in the words of the respondents. But this is done, the transcription process is done right after administering the interview. Partially categorized questions. In interviews, questions are often asked as open-ended questions, but to facilitate recording and analysis, some answers can already be pre-categorized. What does it mean? For example, we can ask, how did you become a member of the village health committee? and you can provide the respondent in the oral form the following choices. And next to each of the choices, you provide a space for the respondent to give you more details, which you will record in the written form. There are advantages of pre-categorized answers. Answers can be recorded quickly and analysis is easier. Sometimes, if the respondent hesitates in answering, the interviewer may be tempted to present some possible answers, thereby causing bias or prejudice. In other words, a researcher may never help the respondent in any answer because this causes bias or prejudices. Let's talk about closed questions, the ones we mainly use in questionnaires that are addressed in quantitative studies. Closed questions have a list of possible options or answers from which the respondents must choose from. Closed questions may be used to get the respondents to express their opinions or attitudes by choosing rating points on a scale. For example, we can ask the following in a questionnaire. What is your opinion on the following statement? Women who have induced abortion should be severely punished. And then the respondent is provided with the following choices for him or her to choose. Closed questions may also be used if one is only interested in certain aspects of an issue and does not want to waste time obtaining more information than one needs. That's why this type of questions are mainly used in quantitative studies. We already know what we want, and that's it. For example, a researcher who is only interested in the sources of protein in a family diet may ask, did you eat any of the following foods yesterday? Circle yes if at least one item in each set of items is eaten. The set of items, the respondent is going to choose yes if at least one of the items was eaten, or no if none of them was eaten in any of the items. Let's see advantages of asking closed questions. Asking closed questions saves time. Comparing responses of different groups, doing triangulation, or of the same group over time becomes easier. In other words, when asking closed questions, it is easier for the researcher to do triangulation, to compare the different answers gotten. So this saves time. Let's study some steps in designing a questionnaire or an interview guide or an observation checklist. Designing a good questionnaire always takes several drafts. When designing questionnaires, first, consider the content. Second, consider the formulation and sequencing of the questions. Third, consider the format. Fourth, test run or validate. The test run means validation. We validate the instrument, the questionnaire. The questionnaire gives us the information we required and whether interviewers as well as respondents feel at ease with it. Usually the questionnaire will need some further adaptation before we can use it for actual data collection. What does it mean? After validating the instrument, it may be the questionnaire or the interview guide or the the observation guide, after validating each of the instruments, we usually find certain things that must be improved. So we do further adaptations, and in that way, the tool will be suitable for data collection. Let's see a little bit more about the content. Let's study it a little bit more in depth. When considering the content, take your objectives and operationalization of variables as a starting point. Remember that every question or every item you prepare is based on an indicator of the operationalization of the variables. Step 2, formulate one or more questions that will provide the information needed for each indicator. Okay, sometimes you will need to write a set of questions, not only one per indicator. Why? Let's see why. It is because we're going to avoid leading questions. And we're going to check whether each question measures one thing at a time. Let's talk about leading questions. A leading question suggests certain answer. A leading question presupposes a certain condition. For example, if we ask, what action did you take last time your child had a cold? When asking this, we're presupposing the child has had a cold. So never take for granted that someone has gone under certain condition. A better set of questions would be, has your child ever had a cold? If yes, when was the last time? Did you do anything to treat it? If yes, what? So first, we have to make sure, in this case, that the child has had a cold in certain moment. So we cannot start by saying, what action did you take last time your child had a cold? Because you don't know if the child has had a cold. Avoid words with double or fairly defined meanings or that are emotionally laden. In other words, full of emotions. Concepts such as dirty classrooms, lazy students, or unhealthy food, good conditions, bad conditions, for example, should be omitted. Why? Because they are fairly defined and sometimes emotionally laden, and they are very subjective terms as well. Ask sensitive questions in a socially acceptable way. Questions relating to personal issues such as vices or mental illnesses in the family are usually sensitive. Why? Because they can harm people's feelings, so they must be avoided. Such questions should be formulated in such a way that the question does not judge or embarrass the respondent. Many teenagers have acquired vices such as alcoholism. Have you ever experienced drinking alcohol? This is a type of question you cannot ask because it may hurt feelings. Instead, you could ask, if a friend was considering drinking alcohol while in school, what would you advise her or him? Let's see the step 3, sequencing the questions. Step 3, sequencing the questions. Design your interview schedule. Schedule in this case means list of questions or questionnaire to be informant friendly. The sequence of questions must be logical for the informant. At the beginning of an interview or of a questionnaire, a limited number of questions concerning background variables such as age, education, and marital status may be asked, as informants may be reluctant to provide personal information and may become worried about confidentiality or bored by a list of unrelated and, to them, senseless questions. In this case, you should restrict yourself to an essential minimum. Try to include just the important questions you consider you need in order to collect the necessary data. Step 4, formatting the questionnaire. Step 4, formatting the questionnaire. When you finalize your questionnaire, be sure that a separate introductory page is attached to each questionnaire, explaining the purpose of the study, requesting the informant's consent to be interviewed, and assuring confidentiality of the data obtained. Each questionnaire has a heading and a space to insert number, date, and location. You may add the name of the interviewer to facilitate quality control, but observe that this is the name of the interviewer, the person who is asking questions, not the name of the respondent, the one who is answering. Layout is such that questions belonging together appear together visually. If the questionnaire is long, if you cannot avoid asking certain questionnaires and your questionnaire becomes, if you cannot avoid asking certain questionnaires and your questionnaire becomes very long, you may use subheadings for groups of questions. The subheadings can be the variables of your hypothesis. This is an example of a questionnaire. Here we have all the information we normally write at the start, the date, the researcher's name for further information, right? The direction and the generalities, then each of the questions with the corresponding boxes in a site-friendly way, as you can see, all right? Provide sufficient space for answers to open-ended questions if you are asking open-ended questions. Categories such as other and for comments on pre-categorized questions. All right, you have to provide sufficient space in this case, but this doesn't happen in questionnaires that are used in quantitative studies. Boxes for pre-categorized answers are placed in a consistent manner on the right half of the page. Make sure that you use simple everyday language. If interviews are carried out in English, or if questionnaires are carried out in English or any other secondary language, local terminology should be used for crucial concepts that do not have the exact equivalent in the secondary language. All steps discussed above apply to written questionnaires as well as to observation guides and questions used in interviews. For written questionnaires, however, clear guidelines will have to be added on how the answers to questions should be filled in. Why? Because written questionnaires are normally addressed to a large population. And if, imagine, many people have questions related with directions, for example, you cannot be answering questions of a large population. That's why you have to make sure that you include clear guidelines in your written questionnaire. Now let's talk about checklists, which is another technique. Checklists can be used to systematically observe human behavior or the condition of specific equipment. Sometimes the aim is systematic content analysis when we are observing, for example, newspaper articles, documents at a school, etc. A checklist includes all the items or points that must be considered during an observation in the field or when extracting data from existing records. Example: checklist for rating class development. Let's see the example. This is an example of a checklist, a very simple one. Remember that here we have to write all the information needed. Okay, the same one we use for questionnaires or interviews, as in the previous example. Then you include every question based on every indicator you have in the operationalization of the variables. Okay, what did you observe? Students asking questions. The rate: 1 is low and 5 is high. You can also use another scale here, a scale of yes or no. For example, students asking questions, yes or no. Another scale you can use is that of frequencies. You can write, for example, never, sometimes, usually, always, for you to tackle. Okay, but remember that every question or every item you include in any of the tools will come from the operationalization of the variables. Every question will come from an indicator, and in some cases you're going to need to ask a set of questions in order to avoid leading questions. All right, this is all for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a nice day.